This workshop is an hour and a half. We conduct it as an AA meeting with a abbreviated format in the interest of saving a little time. We'll take a 10-minute break at the midway point. And today we are continuing our study of the four-step and how to teach the four-step. We'll be on the four-step for another 3 weeks today and 2 more weeks after this, probably. Depends on how quickly we move. Last week we took a look at the four-step and what it is and why it is and what it's intended to do and what the results of working a four-step would be. These are things which it's important for your sponsees to know what they're looking at and what's going to be happening. Remember that there are 5 results of a properly worked four-step. 1, that we will lose our resentments. They'll be gone. And it may be difficult to believe that, but it happens to be absolutely true because the spiritual solution to resentments is in the four-step, and we're going to study that today and how to teach it and how to go about working with your sponsee to see to it that they are freed from their resentments. 2, we'll begin to lose our fears. 3, we'll have an ideal for our future sex life and our relationship life with other people in general. 4, we're going to have a list of all the people we've harmed, and we will have commenced the process of becoming willing to make amends to them all. In other words, our 8-step list is done in the four-step. And 5, we're going to have a list of all of our defects of character, principally those defects which are specifically addressed in the four steps: resentment, dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. In addition to that, your sponsee will have taken several leaps of faith, which commences the process of developing faith, because as these leaps of faith are answered, and as they begin to see that the directions in the big book and your instructions are correct, that the results are that God enters into their lives and performs things for them they couldn't do for themselves, their faith begins to grow. There are many other things that will be the result of this four-step. With many people, this four-step is the beginning of a process which we call self-awareness. Because so many of us, when we come in here, are not self-aware, we refuse to be. We have blocked out the truth about ourselves. We have refused, really, to look at what's going on with us today. We much prefer to live in the future with our dream world and to dwell in the past, because in the past we have found the answers to why did we do all these things. We believe that we were the victims of the way people had treated us and the victims of our circumstances, victims of our accidents of birth, parentage, and so on and so on. And we loved that because it gave us an excuse for all of our bad behavior. Now, in the four-step, we're going to come face to face with us. As the big book says, we're going to chew and digest some large pieces of truth about ourselves that we'd never done before. Not only that, but we are also learning something here, which is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. We're learning how to take inventory. We're learning to use the tool of inventory, which is one of the primary tools in our recovery and is going to be with us for the rest of our lives. Inventorying is one of the things we do every day. When we reach the 10th step, we will be specifically directed to take inventory as we go through each day. When we reach the 11th step, again, we have an inventory that we take every night. So here in the 4th step, we're learning how to do this. Not only are we learning how, but we're learning that we can do it, and that when we do it, the results are good, and that we like what we are feeling as we do this. Now, many people and this is a caution for you as sponsors, you must not allow your sponsees to sit very long in their four-step. Because if you do, you're running a grave risk that they're going to relapse. The reason for that is that they're uncovering this whole cesspool that they've been more or less successfully denying and rationalizing all these years. And all of a sudden, whatever is truth about them becomes crystal clear. Not only that, but there are a lot of people out there who have harmed them and toward whom they feel resentment. There are a lot of people out there whom they have hurt. And these are all things they've been trying to dodge and evade and forget and rationalize and push under the rug. So it is a cesspool, and it has to be negotiated very quickly. So if you have somebody you're working with who's dragging their feet and letting themselves get stuck in the four-step, you need to light a fire under them and get them going, because that's a very dangerous place to be. Now, last week we talked about how we would begin our inventory, which is, of course, the resentment list. And we talked about how we make a list of those people who have been significant and important in our lives. And after we've done that, we ask ourselves a series of 5 questions. And those 5 questions will tell us whether we need to write about that particular person or not, because we're looking to see what they did and what the results of their actions were with us. We look to see if they have harmed us in any way. We look to see if they threatened us in any way. We look to see if they made us angry. We look to see if they have wronged us in some way, and we look to see if they've been unfair to us. And if we answer yes to any of those questions with respect to anyone on our list, then we know we must write about them. There's one caveat here. Once in a while, you're going to find a sponsee who can truthfully say, they can look you in the eye and say, I've been freed from that particular resentment. In which case, it is proper to say that you need not write about them. But that's a dangerous situation, and it's better to err on the side of caution. Generally speaking, what I'm going to say to somebody is write about it anyway, and let's see how it comes out. Let's see if maybe there is still some resentment left, because if there is, we need to be free of it. Remember, we talked about this. Resentments are like a cancer, and you would not expect a surgeon to leave any part of a cancer in your body when they were excising the balance of it, knowing that if they did that, you were put at extreme risk. So as sponsors, one of our jobs here is to do the best we can to see that we get it all out. And the way we're going to do that is to try to get our sponsees to make as complete a list as possible, and then to write about whoever is on that list who shows up as having been harmful in some way, or especially if they've been angered by the actions of that person. Now, having done that, we then come to the question, well, what are we going to do about all this stuff? And as I told you before, we're going to be set free from our resentments before we leave our 4th step. So, quite obviously, then, we must be looking at a spiritual solution to our resentments. Keep in mind that the resentment is traceable back to fear. Fear is that force which is the motive force, the trigger mechanism behind the anger and resentment. And in the final analysis, fear is the absence of faith. Or to put it another way, faith and fear can't live in the same house. So, we're looking at resentments as the result or a symptom of spiritual bankruptcy, a spiritual weakness which needs to be overcome, a spiritual malady. You remember we read back a couple pages back that when the spiritual malady is overcome, we do straighten out mentally and physically. It's a direct promise, and it happens to be true. So, therefore, we're going to need to apply a spiritual remedy to a spiritual problem. when you look at it from that standpoint, it takes it clear out of the province of human solutions. We're no longer talking about being entitled to your feelings, or owning this, or owning that, or any of this other stuff. We're talking about something which is no longer in the realm of esoterica. It's not a metaphysical problem. It's a spiritual weakness, which can be, the solution of which is a spiritual solution. And once we understand that, we know what we're dealing with here, and we can put aside all this other stuff. Now let's go to the top of page 68 and see what we're doing here. We're going to start down at the bottom of page 60. I'm sorry, I got you on the wrong page. Start at the bottom of page 65, and then we'll go over on 66. Last three lines on 65. We went back through our lives. Nothing counted but thoroughness and honesty. This is what we're just talking about, guys, and it's your job as a sponsor to try to guide that thoroughness and insist upon that honesty, because nothing less is going to work. When we were finished, we considered it carefully. The first thing apparent was that the world and its people were often quite wrong. Now, that had given us and our sponsees a lot of comfort, knowing that everything around them there was a lot of wrongs going on out there, and they'd been told over and over again that they could trace their own bad behavior, their bad thinking, to the wrongs of others, and the fact that the world was wrong. There's such things as the only thing that is a sin is to get caught doing it. You know, what if you can get away with it, it's okay, and all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of that around these days, so it isn't saying that your sponsor is going to believe that entirely, but we got to remember that we're dealing with people who, to a large extent, are products of their particular age they're growing up in their environment, and many of these ideas are very well fixed in their minds. The idea is that we're going to do whatever it takes to get what we want. We're going to see to it that the world conforms to our formula. We've been playing God. Now let's go on, top of 66. To conclude that others were wrong was as far as most of us ever got. The usual outcome was that people continued to wrong us and we stayed sore. Sometimes it was remorse, and then we were sore at ourselves. But the more we fought and tried to have our own way, the worse matters got. As in war, the victor only seemed to win. Our moments of triumph were short-lived. This is teaching us that a big part of our resentment life has been spent in thoughts of revenge and getting even. And how do I get back on this person? Not going to get away with that. And all this macho stuff, you know, make my day, you know, this kind of stuff. I don't know what you're talking about, Pilgrim. You know, this kind of stuff.
Give us a break.
And the problem is that all that stuff is great in movies, but it doesn't work worth a darn in real life.
Well, BS in real life.
That's it. So we're going to have to now be taking a look, aren't we, at what's going on here. Notice that on the first three lines at the top of the page, the word wrongs is used three times, one time after another, three consecutive sentences. Now that's unusual with Bill Wilson, because he always tried to use a synonym when he could. And believe me, those of you who have looked it up in the dictionary know that there are probably 20 synonyms for the word wrong or wrongs. But Bill continued to use the same word because he wanted to emphasize something here which is of extreme importance, because it's going to go directly to the question of being set free from these resentments. We're going to need to do something about the wrongs that have been committed against us. And Bill wanted to emphasize for us that we were to look at those wrongs. Now, you remember last week we talked about this. When we do our resentment list, we do not, I repeat, we do not look at our own wrongs. We do not look at our own faults. If you've got forms like that, please don't use them. You're going to see why they don't work. Or if they do work, it's only at half speed. it's imperative at this point that your sponsee recognize the wrongs that have been done to him or her with no equivocation and no shading of it, and no rationalizations and no denials and no saying, well, gee whiz, no wonder she did that to me, look what I did to her. And then some sponsors will say, but she did the best she could. And she didn't. Except in very rare circumstances, the people who have harmed us were doing exactly what their selfishness told them to do, and their illness led them to do. That's a fact. And it doesn't gain us anything by trying to say that they really were good people. They were sheep in wolf's clothing. And because they were really sheep, we can't be mad at them. It's not the point. It is not the point at all. We're not looking here at the justification for a resentment. The minute we do that, we're totally off base. This is what we've been doing before. Of course I'm mad at her. Look what she did to me. No wonder I have this resentment. Look what they did to me. We're going to put that aside entirely. This is a mechanical process. Believe me when I say this. As devoid of emotion as possible. We can't get rid of it all, obviously. There's going to be a lot of stuff in emotional content in this, but as clearly as we can, we're going to look to see what they did that harmed us. What were the wrongs they committed? And we also need to start looking now at what were the consequences to us. Well, one of the consequences we have already discovered here is that we were consumed in many instances with getting back, getting even, revenge, fantasizing perhaps at night and trying to go to sleep about how we would get revenge on this particular person or this particular institution, blow up the police station or whatever, take out the judges. The point is that these fantasies were occupying our brains at times when we needed to be concentrating on things that were positive. Now let's go down to the next paragraph. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile? We're throwing the hours away. We are flushing our daily lives down the toilet. We're throwing everything into the trash can. And by the way, if you wonder why I'm going through this word for word with you, because this is what I want you to do with your sponsees, so that they will understand clearly what it is they're looking at here. Take this book and use it as your teaching tool. Those of you who have done the steps with me know that that's exactly the way we do it. Going on, but with the alcoholic whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal, for when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Now let's stop and think about this. Here's the big book telling us that hanging on to these resentments is not only infinitely grave, but that it is fatal. Why? Well, it's simple. Let's go back to the basics and we'll understand it clearly. Basic number one, we are alcoholics. Basic number two, alcoholism is a disease which is incurable and invariably fatal. Number three, we are powerless over alcohol. We can't stop on our own. Basic number four, the only solution which is offered in this program is to interpose the power of a loving God between us and the alcohol. In other words, we're going to have to get into a state of surrender where God can literally take over our lives and provide us with the shield that we must have. Or in other words, to grant us the power which we do not have on our own to be free of the power of alcohol over us. Now what happens if we are blocked from the sunlight of the Spirit? It should be pretty obvious that there's no room for God to come in. In other words, whatever blocks us from God is fatal to us because it removes from us the possibility of a solution. The Big Book tells us that we have to find a power greater than ourselves which will solve our problem. And that's what this book is all about. The purpose of this book is to give us the tools to find and surrender to a power greater than ourselves which will solve our problem. Therefore, anything which is going on with us, these insanities and resentments are pure insanity, that block us from God will necessarily block us from recovery. That's why these resentments have to go, because they are infinitely grave and they are fatal. Let's see what the book says. For when harboring such feelings, we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the Spirit, the insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again, and with us to drink is to die. That's the progression. Now let's see what's going to happen. Please turn to page 84. At the bottom of page 84, we have just learned how to work the 10th step. In other words, we have just now reached the 10th step, which means that we have worked the first 9 steps, in particular 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And in 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9, we had found the solution to our insanities and our guilts. In other words, we'd been given the tools to free ourselves with God's help from our defects of character and from our guilts. Now let's see what happens. 4 lines up from the bottom. We have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we will find that this has happened automatically. Let's go down about 5 or 6 lines. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We have not even sworn off. Listen to this now. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. See, that's where we're headed. And here at the 4th step, we're taking the initial steps to reach that point where the problem will have been removed and it no longer exists for us. Now we can begin to see how critical this is. Yes, ma'am.
I've been in recovery for many years. I've tried to help a lot of women that I've sponsored, and I wasn't always successful.
I couldn't hear you, ma'am.
I said I've sponsored a lot of women in the past in recovery, and I wasn't always successful.
Yes.
So I've done a number of 4th steps, maybe 5, 6 in the past. And I was taught that the spiritual principle behind the 4th step is courage. That honesty is the first step, and hope and faith. That's how I work.
Yes. There's a
Well, I found that a lot of people are sponsoring have misunderstood the word courage. They thought it meant courage to fight, whereas it's really, for me, it's the courage to surrender to a higher power and the courage to heal in the past. A lot of people, men and women, misinterpret that. They think it means the courage to fight. And a lot of times it's, they have a lot of misplaced anger. And a lot of the women I've worked with, that I've listened to and learned from in the last 20 years of recovery, they were spiritually not well themselves. So I found that there were resentments sometimes towards these sponsors. Now that I'm trying to learn to sponsor myself and other women, I find that I'm not always emotionally available to help another human being. I need to concentrate on my own recovery. But if I can, then I will try to use whatever courage, whatever I've learned in the past to heal and recover, my experience, strength, and hope with another human being, whatever their addiction is or illness,
Okay.
not necessarily alcohol. But
Let's
courage is the 4th step, and when I dwell too much on the 4th step, you're absolutely
let me see if I can help you with this. There were three guys in Texas who sat down one day and decided they were going to determine the principles behind the steps. And so they wrote them down and they sent this into the Grapevine. And the Grapevine published it. The problem is that their whole premise is incorrect to begin with, because the steps are the principles. And you cannot have a principle behind a principle. Principles as far as you go with it. The other thing is that, for example, in their choice of the word courage as a principle behind the fourth step, they fail to recognize that it is in the fifth step that we learn enough fearlessness as we find necessary, and courage is not an issue in the fourth step in accordance with the Big Book. Also, we also know that the ability to be honest with oneself is paramount. We hear that every time we hear the chapter 5 read, that if we can't be honest with ourselves, we can't recover. That is going to take a certain amount of intestinal fortitude in and of itself. But so does turning our life and our will over to the care of God that we can't see, touch, or feel. So does, for some of us, just the bare fact of being willing to admit that there is a God there who is in charge of everything. So it is axiomatic, I believe, that people who do not have some modicum of courage don't make it in here anyway. But the fourth step is not the place where courage is learned, nor is courage the basis for the fourth step. Because if you start talking about courage being the principle behind the fourth step, then everything in the fourth step is going to depend upon whether.
Face yourself is what I was talking about.
Well, there cannot be a principle behind a principle. That's a logical impossibility, and I'd like to share with you something here. This is what Bill Wilson wrote in the foreword of the 12 and 12. AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which if practiced as a way of life can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. What we're dealing with here is spiritual principles stated as steps of action. If one were to follow this through and go back into history, one would find that these same ideas were expressed, for example, in the Bible, in the book of James, for example, and in the Koran. We find them scattered throughout Proverbs and Psalms, and we find them throughout the Old Testament. We find them in some of the Buddhist writings and the Shinto writings. All people over the centuries have recognized the spiritual principles embodied as steps of action in our 12 steps. For example, the fifth step was something which Paul commented on to the Ephesians. He said, you must confess your faults one to another. And this is not the first time that had been written. It just happened to be right there in the Bible, and we can see it. So, in other words, we're not dealing here with something which can be defined in terms of wonderful traits of character. We're talking about spiritual, the deepest kind of spiritual principles, and the taking an inventory of ourselves is the principle that we must. This business of being honestly self-aware is the principle.
But 4 and 10 go together.
Huh?
Every day I take a 10th step at night, which is self-inventory.
Well, the 10th step is taken during the day, and the 11th step inventory is taken at night. They're two separate inventories. So what I would suggest is that perhaps if you could put aside the idea that there are principles behind the steps and learn to work the steps, to follow the directions precisely, you will find then that what's happening is that you are teaching people to take these great spiritual principles and incorporate them into their lives so that they become a part of themselves. This is the way they live their lives. Remember, the Big Book says that the spiritual life is not a theory. We have to live it. And so the 12-step teaches us we're to practice these principles in all of our affairs. Just after it talks about having worked the steps. These principles refers to the steps. So what that means is then that we're going to incorporate the 12 steps into our lives, and we're going to use those as the basis for our way of life and our way of living. Does all that make sense?
Some people don't understand it, kind of goes around their head.
Well, that's right. And
So
here,
it's hard for me, I get frustrated trying to explain the principles, like 10 step is perseverance.
no, ma'am, it's not. No, ma'am, it's not. The 11th step would, if you wanted to follow the big book, in the 11th step it tells us that we are undisciplined and we have to let God discipline us in the way we've just outlined, which applies directly to the 11th step. So even if one were to stretch the thing and say that perseverance is a principle behind a step, it would have to be behind the 11th step, because that's what the big book specifically tells us. However, once you get the idea, for example, this monograph these guys wrote says that honesty is the principle of the first step, but the first step is a gift. And then if you were to say, well, wait a second, isn't honesty in every step? So how can you say it's the principle of the first step? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to beat this dead horse. What I'm hoping that I've induced you to take another look at this, because people spend a lot of time memorizing these things, and they're non sequiturs. They don't compute, and they don't even compute logically, let alone on the basis of the reality of the thing, which is that our 12 steps are spiritual principles in and of themselves, and you can't have a principle behind a principle. Okay. All right, going back to page. Oops, holy cow! Where's this time gone? You guys are in for a 10-minute break. Would be 6, please. Let's go to the second full paragraph just below the midway down the page. This little paragraph is often overlooked. You need to make sure your sponsee sees it and understands it. First sentence, if we were to be free, if we were to live, which of course is as opposed to die, we had to be free of anger. Well, now, whoa, wait a minute. A lot of people tell us that anger is perfectly natural and that there is appropriate anger and that we're supposed to own it or something like that. But this is telling us that if we were to live, we had to be free of anger. The grouch and the brainstorm were not for us. Brainstorm there doesn't mean bright idea. It means a storm of the brain. And the grouch, of course, is another word for anger. They may be the dubious luxury of normal men, but for alcoholics, these things are poison. Anger is a poison for us. Why? Well, it's very simple, isn't it? When we are angry, we are blocked off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Therefore, we have to learn how to stay free of anger. We're going to do that. You may think, well, wait a second, anger is something which is so pervasive. Everybody gets angry once in a while. Some of us get angry a lot. How are we going to stay free of anger? Well, we have the 10th step, and we have the 11th step. And the moment that anger comes up in the 10th step, we write it down. We inventory it, in other words. And we talk to somebody about it, and we ask God to remove it. And if we've hurt somebody while we were angry, we make amends quickly. And then we turn our thoughts to somebody we can help. We've got the tools. And if anger persists during the day, at night when we inventory in our 11th step, we're going to see it's still there. We're going to do whatever is necessary to get free of it. If somebody says to you, there is appropriate anger, my goodness sakes alive, don't you know that? You ask them, okay, I respect your belief, but I would like you to answer a question for me. Is there such a thing as appropriate strychnine? Because that's exactly what our anger is for us. It's a killer. The other thing to recognize about this paragraph, and you need to teach your sponsees this over and over again, because most of the stuff we teach is not going to sink in the first time or the second or even the third or fourth time. We just keep doing it. Anger is the result of fear. We do not get angry unless we are threatened in some way. We have perceived some kind of a threat. And as a result of that, our anger comes up. Peach would never be angry with me unless I threatened Peach in some way. Now, since anger is triggered by fear, ultimately the solution to anger is the growth of faith. Because as faith grows and fears recede, we will get angry less and less. I can tell you that after 36 years, I stay serene enough that you'd have to hold a mirror up to my mouth to make sure I'm alive most of the time. And the people who know me well know that that's the truth. I don't get angry because I don't feel threatened. If I feel in fear, I'm insulting God. I'm saying to God, I don't trust you. Well, I do trust him. I don't have to be afraid anymore. And so this business of anger is resolved, and it is solved over a period of time as a result of the growth of faith. And the problem of fear is resolved over a period of time by the growth of faith. And your job is to help your sponsees find their faith, and you do that by teaching them to take leaps of faith, to suck it up and let God have the result. And every time they do that, they're going to say, wow, that worked again. Now we go back to page 66. We turn back to the list, for it held the key to the future. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? The key to the future lies in this resentment list. If we are not freed from these resentments, our future is bleak indeed. We are prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. You remember last week I gave you the word domination as something to look up in the dictionary. And now we see why. You want your sponsee to understand what domination means. They're not in charge. They're being ruled by their resentments. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had the power to actually kill. Now we know why that is, because these resentments block us from the sunlight of the Spirit, and without God we are going to die of the disease of alcoholism. Period. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered. But how? We could not wish them away any more than alcohol. Therefore, we now know that we are as powerless over our resentments as we are over alcohol. Remember earlier on we found out that we are as powerless over our self and selfishness and self-centeredness as we are over alcohol. This cannot be wished away. We're dealing here with things which are operating below the level of conscious thought. These things are triggered by our and products of our natural God-given instincts. And so therefore, we don't have power over them. We can't cure our sick minds with our sick minds. And no human being is going to have the power to do that for us. And this is where all of the people in the healing professions come up against a brick wall, because they can help us to find out what's going on with us, and they can suggest all kinds of remedies, human solutions. They can get us to relax, they can feed us pills, they can psychoanalyze us, they can put us on a couch, they can give us electroshock therapy, they can They can try to do some Pavlovian stuff on us. They even poison us. And none of this stuff works. And they can't understand why. Why is it that we can't break through so that when the person sees what's really going on with them, they really understand themselves and why they drink, that isn't going to be enough. The Big Book tells us flat out that self-knowledge is not the solution to alcoholism. We don't get sober and stay sober through self-knowledge any more than we get sober and stay sober through fear. Now, the Big Book has posed the question here, has posed the problem here, and as it always does, immediately thereafter gives us a solution. Down at the bottom of page 66, we now are coming to the solution. This was our course. We realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick, but we did not like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us. They, like ourselves, were sick too. We asked God to help us show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. Well, now, these three sentences struck a responsive chord in me, because I'd always wanted to think about these folks who had done me wrong as being sick. But now the Big Book is telling me, yes, that's true. That's what is the problem. And then I got thinking about, well, wait a minute, isn't it just a convenient excuse, a rationalization, so that if I accept this as the truth, then I'll quit being angry at them, just so I'm not going to be angry at a sick person? The Big Book answers that question. Go to page 116, please. This is in the chapter to wives, the second full paragraph, halfway down the page. We have elsewhere remarked how much better life is when lived on a spiritual plane. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, He can solve your problems too. Here comes the rule now. We wives found that, like everybody else. Think about that phrase. That's the whole world. All human beings. We wives found that, like everybody else, we were afflicted with pride, self-pity, vanity, and all the things which go to make up the self-centered person, and we were not above selfishness and dishonesty. Remember back there, a few pages back in the third step, we discovered that our problem was self and selfishness and self-centeredness. That this was the root of our trouble. That driven by 100 forms of fear, selfishness, self-centeredness, self-pity, that we had trod on the toes of our fellows and they retaliated. Then we learned our troubles, we believe, are of our own making, that they arise out of self. And the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. In other places, the Big Book tells us we are the authors of our own misery. God didn't do it. In other places, it tells us that we're faced with a self-imposed crisis. That therefore the basis of our illness is self and selfishness and self-centeredness and pride and ego and dishonesty and all those defects that we're finding in our four steps. And the Big Book is saying, but look, these are universal traits. There are a few saints out there, of course, who don't have any of these things wrong with them. But it's almost, you can count on it, that the people who have harmed you or harmed your sponsee have one or more or many of these very serious spiritual deficiencies. This is the hallmark. These are the symptoms of spiritual bankruptcy. And it doesn't really seem to matter how many times a week they go to church or how pious they may be or how there's something going on here that we need to recognize, because we're going to have to get past the idea that the people who harmed us were inherently evil. And many of us had come to that conclusion. A lot of there are rare instances where you're going to find people who are amoral. who have no morals, who have no sense of right and wrong, whose sole motivation is the gratification of self. But that's pretty rare. We're talking there about a purely psychotic condition. Most people we deal with are going to be people who have the same problems we have, they just don't drink over. This leads us then to the proposition that we need to do something which is directly opposite of what we have always done. That is, now we're going to pray for them. The prayer on page 67. 5, 6 lines down from the top. This is a sick man. How can I be helpful to him? Notice that the first thing we ask God is how to be helpful to this person. The very first words out of our mouth. How can I be helpful to this person? God, save me from being angry. That's my prayer. Thy will be done. Now there is something implicit and inherent, like extent, that I am willing to forgive the trespasses of others. Now we begin to see that we're dealing here with a spiritual solution which cuts right to the chase. One of the things that we're going to be asking God to do in our 11th step, maybe every night, is to forgive us. We're asking for forgiveness. What is the absolute bottom line requirement in seeking forgiveness? That we be willing to forgive those who have trespassed against us. So we find here that forgiveness of the wrongs that have been done to us is absolute essential to be freed from the ravages of these resentments. Most people are probably not able to forgive in the abstract. Theologians and writers on this subject have opined, and I think it's true, that if you wish to have forgiveness for another, all that's necessary to do is to ask God to make you willing to forgive. In seeking the willingness to forgive, you will find that forgiveness comes. Now let's turn to page 552. This is one of the more important parts of the big book. We find it in the story Freedom from Bondage. The lady who wrote this story was a wonderful spiritual lady. Middle paragraph, right in the middle of the page. If you have a resentment you want to be free of, if you will pray for the person or thing you resent, you will be free. If you will ask in prayer for everything you want for yourself to be given to them, you will be free. Ask for their health, their prosperity, their happiness, and you will be free. Even when you don't really want it for them and your prayers are only words and you don't mean it, go ahead and do it anyway. Do it every day for 2 weeks and you will find you have come to mean it and to want it for them, and you will realize that where you used to feel bitterness and resentment and hatred, you now feel compassionate understanding and love. It is absolutely clear. Our experience proves it to us over and over again, that when we pray for somebody else, we cannot at the same time harbor hatred. The hatred has to give way. It may take a little while, but it goes away. And it is replaced with love. Why? I don't know. But I do know that that's exactly what happens. And so, regardless of how many times we have been told that we are perfectly justified in our hatred for somebody and what they did to us, and these horrible things, and some of them were horrible, that justification is killing us. Believing that we are justified, we have gone forward with a self-destructive mode which is absolutely fatal to us. For when harboring these resentments, we are shut off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Therefore, we are shut off from recovery through God's grace. Now then, when you have completed this with your sponsee, what you will find is that he or she will have lost their resentments. They'll be gone. We have at least 3 people in this room, 4 people in this room, I know for sure, have already experienced that. And they would be willing, I'm sure, to say, yay, that's exactly what happened. It is true. Right, Gene?
Right.
Right, Maris?
Right.
Right, Mike?
Yeah, definitely.
Right, Billy?
Right.
There's 4 people. You don't have to take my word for it. This is exactly what happened. We're set free from our resentments. Beautiful, huh? And notice that this didn't have anything to do with being talked out of them or rationalizing them away. It had to do with what? Action that we took. We took the action necessary to be freed from our resentments, and it worked. Beautiful, huh? And this is the lesson that you need to learn to pass on to your sponsee. Each of the tasks that we are set out to perform, the directions are in the big book, these are tasks which lead inevitably to surrender, lead inevitably to the solution to our problem, and to recovery from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. It is the action, the action, the action. We cannot sit around and think about this stuff, philosophize about it, wait for osmosis to set in. We must take the action as directed by the big book. Never fall into the trap of just fake it till you make it. Everything requires, the beginning requires willingness to receive the benefits. If I'm going to go to God because I'm told that if I go to God, I will find Him, I have to be willing to find Him. If my mind is closed, it's not going to work. So what we're going to do is, we're not going to fake anything. What we're going to do is we're going to follow directions. And we follow directions. What does it tell us in the book over and over again? As we have done this work, we have received all the promised benefits, all the promised grace, all the promised miracles will come into our lives. There is no doubt about that. Now then, let's go to page 67, the middle of the page. Here is where we commence our study of the second part of the 4-step. This second part of the 4-step is where we are going to locate our own faults, our own weaknesses, our own defects of character. We're also going to locate some of the people that we've harmed. And so we're going to be brought face to face with our guilt, remorse, and shame. Up to now, what we have been doing is examining the faults and wrongs of others. Now that we have been set free from our resentments, now we may look at ourselves, not before. If I look at my faults before I try to be free from the resentments, all that I have done is to blur the edges of what was done to me. If I am to forgive the faults and the wrongs of others, I have to know precisely what it is I'm forgiving. And the moment that I begin to indulge myself in comparative fault, I blur the edges of everything. Not only what they did to me, but maybe even more importantly, what I did to them. I blur the edges of my own faults, and I've got to see those clearly if I'm going to have any relief from them. Yes, Leslie?
So then somebody that's working that's having a lot of trouble with the resentments would complete the first list and then pray for a week or two before they move on to the 4th step.
Well, it
Before
depends.
they move on to the next list.
Some people are, one night of prayer is all it takes. But sometimes there are deep-seated hatreds that are going to take a while. 2 weeks is the outside. Most people within 2 or 3 days have had all the relief they need.
somebody that I'm working with specifically that's having trouble, I would suggest that she continue that prayer
Oh, yes.
until she moves on and do not
Yes,
start the next week.
absolutely.
Okay.
You want to be sure that they're freed from their resentments before you move on. Otherwise, everything gets all mixed up in their heads. It becomes a mishmash, and then nothing gets done right. Okay, so what we're going to be doing here in this second part of the fourth step is find out what's wrong with us, without reference to what's wrong with other people. And this part of the fourth step is looking at 3 specific cardinal defects. We've already handled resentments. That's done. That's over here. It's done. We're not going to be addressing that again in the fourth step. We will in the fifth step, but not in the fourth step. Now we're looking for selfishness, dishonesty, and fear. Remember, we have resentment, selfishness, dishonesty, and fear. Those are the 4 cardinal defects. The big book has us finding them in the fourth step, finding them again in the 10th step, and finding them again in the 11th step. There's never any variation from that. Again, I say to you, forget the 7 deadly sins. They do not apply in AA. Now, if you've got somebody who's highly religious, it may very well apply to them personally, and that's fine. Nobody here is trying to tell anyone how they're to believe religiously. But as far as the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous is concerned, there are but 4 defects, and we do not deal in sin. We do not set ourselves up as arbiters of anyone else's conduct. We do not label what people do, things that people do, as sinful. We can show them, if we're smart enough, we're going to be able to show them how these things didn't work. All the stuff that they were doing didn't work. From a practical standpoint, your life was a mess. It was a failure. These things didn't work. Now start doing the things that will work, and your whole life will change. Everything will change. And at the very bottom, at the most simple terms, that's what we do. Yes, Mark.
Says over here, referring back to our list. Let's say you harm somebody, but you had no resentment towards them whatsoever. Let's say out drinking, you decide to do something stupid and decide to steal something, break into something, steal something. That should be on the list of harms, shouldn't it?
That you did to them?
Yeah.
Well, sure.
Okay, so that's not really on my list, but that's what I was saying.
The list is the resentment list.
Yeah. Because I was just saying there's some things I've harmed people I had no resentment towards whatsoever.
Okay, that's right.
Okay.
That's right. Yes.
Jim, if you put somebody on your list, let's say that you were not in a position to really do anything about it, you were young, would it be fear because you didn't talk back to them or stand up for yourself? Let's say somebody verbally abused you when you were young, and it just went on, and you just let it go. I mean, is that you put it on yourself? Is it fear because you didn't stand up for yourself?
Well, most of the stuff that we deal with is behavior of our behavior, which took place after we were old enough and strong enough to be responsible for our own behavior and for our own lives.
So don't put it on, just let it go?
Huh?
So just let something like that go?
Let go of what now? That you've been abused, or that you stood up to the abuse?
You were verbally abused.
If you stood up to the abuse?
And you never stood up to it. I mean, you just took it.
Okay. That would be
But it's not
that would be pretty typical, wouldn't it, if it was in a family situation, because there's a tremendous issue there of dependency, and there's also a fact is that there are the people, the adults around us are bigger and stronger than we are,
Right.
and they can withhold food, they can withhold love. There's all kinds of things that can happen if we were to stand up to them. So I don't understand why would that be?
Have a resentment for that. How do you turn it around and put it on yourself? What do you?
Oh, okay. Well,
My question is like, how do you
all right.
put
Look,
that on yourself? or a kid, they were an adult.
What we're
Right,
looking
they had
at,
power.
what we're looking at here is the growth of our defects of character. When we say our wrongs, we're talking about our defects. But we're also talking about the things we've done to harm others. These two things are intermingled much of the time, but not always. The fact that your actions demonstrate a defect does not necessarily mean that you hurt the other person. Now, Mark asked a question about, suppose that you hurt somebody who wasn't on your resentment list. You're going to take care of that in your 8-step, because you're always going to have, most people have to add something in their 8-step when they get to it, because it wasn't picked up in the 4-step. But this 4-step will uncover, see, it is not designed to uncover every instance of our defects showing up. It is designed to uncover them to such an extent that we can no longer deny that they are there. In other words, what we're doing here is learning about ourselves. We're learning what it is that's wrong with us. Dishonesty, selfishness, and fear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that an incident like that just adds to the fear. You know?
Okay. Now then, let's see what we're going to do here. We're going to go back to our resentment list. We're going to put out of our minds the wrongs that others have done, and we resolutely look for our own mistakes. We have 5 questions that we're going to answer about everybody on our resentment list. Let's take an example. Suppose Papa is on our resentment list. First question, with respect to Papa, where had I been selfish? Next question, with respect to Papa, where had I been dishonest? Next question, where had I been self-seeking? Next question, where had I been frightened? Now, I want you to underline the word where, because it's important to understand that this is not was I. This is not yes or no. The word where means that this requires a narrative answer. We must write down what we did that was selfish or dishonest or self-seeking or frightened. Now, in many instances, you're going to find that the what or the where is going to revolve around an attitude that you had or a motivation that you had. It may not have been overt action. And so we're going to look for actions, motivations, and attitudes. Where had I been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Those 4 questions. And then we go down 3 lines. Where was I to blame? So those are the 5 questions that we answer. And in doing that, we're going to uncover our dishonesty, our selfishness, and our fear. We're also going to be identifying much of the harm that we have done to others. And that last question, where was I to blame, is very important, because it's this kind of question that we're going to be answering the rest of our lives. Requires introspection and requires honesty. Requires us that we be willing to honestly state what it is that we could have done better. These are the kinds of things we never wanted to look at in the past. It also will trigger us in looking to see, because these are like what I could have done better, what could I have done instead, that brings us back to what in fact I did, and we can begin to see the destructiveness of our defects. One of the most important things that's going to come out of this part of our 4-step, this second part, is that we're going to begin to recognize just how powerful these defects have been in our lives, just how much damage they've done to us, just how much of our failure in life and our failures in our relationships and our businesses and our families has been due to the existence of these defects. And so it's critically important that these questions all be answered with respect to everybody on the resentment list. And when they are, let's go on. Page 67. The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and were willing to set these matters straight. You can see in that last sentence that that's the 8th step, isn't it? We're admitting our wrongs toward these people honestly, and we're becoming willing to make amends to set these matters straight. So this is the first taste we have of the 8-step cropping up in the 4-step. Now by doing this, what we have done is we have begun the process of self-examination, which will culminate with the 3rd and 4th parts of the 4-step. And next week, we're going to be looking at our fears, and we'll be looking at our sex inventory. And we may finish those next week, but I doubt it. But we'll go as far as we can, and nobody's in any hurry here because we want to do this right. And one of the things I want to emphasize with you guys is this 4-step is absolutely crucial to recovery. It cannot be sloughed over. It is absolutely crucial to recovery, not only from the standpoint of setting a firm foundation for the rest of the steps, but because for the rest of our lives we're going to be asked to be self-aware and to take inventory as we go through life. We absolutely need to learn how to do this here. We need to learn that we can do it, and that when we do it, it works. Yes, preach.
Hi, Jim. You know, in the 11-step inventory on
Page 86,
page 86,
top of the page.
and when you said what could we have done better in 67, the light bulb went on because that's the one that I stump over.
What could I have done better?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Then I can refer, maybe it'd be a little easier for me if I could reflect back to the 67 and look, but usually what happens to me is that I don't remember. When I'm filled with, when I'm disturbed, frustrated, I'm just starting to remember where, to say what would cause me to ask God for the right thought or action. But I like to be able to reflect, like, where can I do better here? And then at night, be able
Sure,
to write
it's all a learning process, huh? It's exactly what we're doing here. We're learning how to use these steps. And when you get the 11-step inventory, that's the culminating inventory because it allows you to see whether you stayed on the path or not. And if you've gotten off the path, you're going to ask God for forgiveness. So if you haven't learned this back in your 4-step, then it's time to start learning how to do it. And if you're not sure what you should do instead, take a good guess. Because you got good instincts. Most of us pretty well know most of the time what it is that we're supposed to do. But we like to rationalize it, and we like to push it aside, and to take the advice of others, advice in quotes, quotation marks, and we get off path, we get off the path. But we know you're not going to have all that much trouble when you concentrate on it, knowing what you should have done instead, especially after you've been around this long. When you get that 11-step, just whatever your intuition tells you, write it down. You're probably going to be right. If you want an infallible guide, what would God have me do?
Yeah, because I was tempted into evil yesterday, that revenge that you were talking about.
Yep.
And I've been using the big book, and that's what kept going through my head. Don't return evil with evil, and forgetting that that's my trait. That's my exact nature of my wrong. Is that's what I do. I look for revenge.
I didn't know you were that mad at me, right?
That's my employer.
Oh, okay. Well, you've got the solutions here. Use them. You don't have to give into that stuff. Remember that it's all triggered by fear. Look to see what's the threat. There's a threat there.
I know what it is.
Promise you.
It's my self-esteem, because yesterday she walked in, she didn't say hi to me or anything, and right away,
Wow.
and she looks at me like her eyes are like that to me, and I told her that not to look at me like that before, and she looked at me like that.
Well, no wonder you want to kill her. I can understand that. Everybody here can understand that. Okay, guys, let's see. I don't know where the time goes. This is wonderful. I'm so delighted all of you are here today, and I hope you got something out of this. Who wants to do the chips today? Before we get started with today's topic, which will be our fears inventory, there's something I want to read to you which was written about 20 years ago, and it is not attributed to anyone. Usually we refer to it as having been written anonymously. And this is one of the finest expositions of the place that sponsors occupy in the fellowship, what it means to be a sponsor, and why is it that we're here. You can judge for yourself. God in His wisdom has selected this group of men and women to be the purveyors of His goodness. In selecting them through whom to bring this phenomenon, He went not to the proud, the mighty, the famous, or the brilliant. He went to the humble, to the sick, to the unfortunate. He went right to the drunkard, the so-called weakling of the world. Well might He have said to us, "Into your weak and feeble hands I have entrusted a power beyond estimate. To you has been given that which had been denied the most learned of your fellows. Not to scientists or statesmen, not to wives or mothers, not even to my priests or ministers have I given this gift of healing other alcoholics, which I entrust to you. It must be used unselfishly. It carries with it grave responsibility. No day can be too long, no demand upon your time can be too urgent, no case too pitiable, no task too hard, no effort too great. It must be used with tolerance, for I have restricted its application to no race, no creed, and no denomination. Personal criticism you must expect. Lack of appreciation will be common. Ridicule may be your lot. Your motives may be misjudged. Success will not always attend your efforts in your work with other alcoholics. You must be prepared for adversity. For what men call adversity is the ladder you must use to ascend the rungs towards spiritual perfection. And remember, in the exercise of this power, I shall not exact of you beyond your capabilities. You are not selected because of exceptional talents, and be careful always, if success attends your efforts, not to ascribe to personal superiority that to which you can lay claim only by virtue of my gift. If I had wanted learned men to accomplish this mission, the power would have been entrusted to the physicians and the scientists. If I had wanted eloquent men, there would have been many anxious for the assignment. For talk is the easiest used of all the talents with which I have endowed mankind. If I had wanted scholarly men, the world is filled with better qualified than you, who would have been available. You were selected because you have been the outcast of the world, and your long experience as drunkards has made or should make you humbly alert to the cries of distress that come from the lonely hearts of alcoholics everywhere. Keep in mind the admission you made on the day of your entrance into AA, namely, that you are powerless, and that it was only with your willingness to turn your life and will into God's keeping that relief came to you. No truer words were ever spoken.
Jim, if you trust me with that, I'll make you some copies.
I have to tell you that, and we were talking about this before the meeting started, the fact that you folks are here on a Saturday afternoon, week after week, shows me a great deal about you. There are always a few who will carry the message, and there are the many who want to skate and slip and slide and take the easy way, who will resist the difficult task of carrying the message. I think it's pretty obvious that If you want to know what the right thing to do is, find the thing which is the hardest to do. The easy things are those things which occupy us and our selfish needs and selfish wants and desires, that give us a way, a way out, give us excuses, give us rationalizations, allow us to be self-deluded, allow us to say to ourselves, I don't need to do this stuff. This is too hard. There must be a better way. There must be an easier way to do it. But you're here, and I honor you for that. And so long as even one of you shows up here on Saturday afternoon, we're going to continue this workshop. Today we're going to be taking a look at the part of the fourth step, which is we call the fears inventory. Begins at the bottom of page 67. Before we begin to look at that, I'd like to share a few things with you, kind of as background. Now first, here is a part of an article that Bill Wilson wrote in 1962, which was published in the Grapevine, called This Matter of Fear. As the AA book says, fear is an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our lives is shot through with it. Fear is surely a bar to reason and to love, and of course it invariably powers anger, vainglory, and aggression. It underlies maudlin guilt and paralyzing depression. President Roosevelt once made the significant remark that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. And that's a pretty sweeping and powerful indictment, but it's absolutely true. One of the things which is so important for us as sponsors to remember is that of all of the things which are bedeviling our sponsee, fear is by far and away the most damaging, the most destructive, and perhaps the most difficult to deal with. Fear is all pervasive. Fear is a product of our sponsee's mind. It has no reality. It always deals with something which is in the future, which has not yet happened. And we're not talking about those fears which arise from the imminency of injury or death, a bus bearing down on us, or a gun at our heads, or somebody with a knife running berserk. The fears we're talking about are the fears which are manufactured. They look to the future, and they always relate to something which has happened in the past. In other words, we perceive a threat, and we perceive the threat because in the past that or similar circumstances have caused us great pain or great discomfort or great disaster or great failure. And it is only natural for human beings to assume that history will repeat itself. And for us, when we're first getting sober, that's the truth of it. History has constantly repeated itself. We've had the same results over and over and over and over again from the same actions. And of course, that's the clue, isn't it? That history cannot determine our present or our future if we change our actions. If we take different action, it is axiomatic that we will achieve a different result, isn't it? There is, by the way, room for the application of significant logic in working the program and in teaching the program to others. And so when we look at fear, we're looking at the enemy. We're looking at a force which has warped and perverted the minds of our sponsees. We're looking at a powerful negative force which has taken God-given natural instincts and turned them into insanity, into a mishmash. Instincts which no longer function as God intended them to function. And of course that's extraordinarily dangerous, isn't it? Because instinctual reactions mean that we are not in control, because these instincts operate below the level of conscious thought. And anything which warps these instincts and makes them dysfunctional is a power which we are going to have to deal with. And we're going to have to deal with it decisively. And that's where the big rub comes in. Because one of the things that you and I have to recognize in working with our sponsees is that they don't have any power over their fears themselves. These fears are products of their own mind, and we cannot cure a sick mind with a sick mind. They are as powerless over their fears as they are over alcohol. They're as powerless over their fears as they are over their resentments or over their selfishness. And so there's going to have to be a solution which goes beyond the human and goes to the spiritual. Did you have a question? And that's the function, one of the main functions of the four-step guys is to provide that solution. Now, one of the things that we've already learned is in order for us to deal with the problem, we have to define it. If we're going to show our sponsees how to deal with fear, we're going to have to show them how to find out what their fears are to begin with, aren't we? Otherwise, how are they going to know what it is that needs to be corrected? Now, there are going to be times when your sponsee may say to you, I don't have any fears. And you can simply smile because you know that without any shadow of doubt that isn't true. What they're saying is, I don't have any fears I acknowledge. And maybe you're talking or working with somebody who has already been taken to the woodshed by the human solution to convince them that these are not really fears, they're just circumstances that we have to learn to walk through, that we have to own them or something like that. So there's a great deal of self-delusion about fear. What you know is that but for fear, they wouldn't be sitting in front of you. But for the effect of fear operating on their natural instincts and driving the rest of their lives, their spiritual bankruptcy would never have occurred. Because we know, it's basic, isn't it, that we're blocked from God, regardless of what our beliefs may be, regardless of how much faith they may be carrying around in their head, they're blocked from God. And that blockage has all been created by the fears which run rampant through their lives. That's why the big book talks about an evil and corroding thread, that the fabric of our lives is shot through with it. Think of trying to weave a beautiful tapestry on a warp and woof of fear. You're never going to get a coherent picture, because all the colored threads will rot and warp and twist around and fall off. When we look at a brand new person, we are looking at a life which has been a disaster, sometimes major, sometimes minor, but nevertheless a disaster, a life of failure. We're looking at a life which is about to be extinguished by the use of alcohol or drugs or both. So we are in a 911 situation. There's one difference between us and emergency room guys. We don't do triage here. We don't make a decision, this one can be helped and this one can't. Never fall for that. Never fall for the popular opinion that so-and-so is never going to make it. They're hopeless. It's never hopeless. Every time we say that another person is hopeless in terms of their possibility of recovery, we are doubting God's power to do precisely that. We mustn't ever do that. We're going to see miracles of recovery. You guys, if you're just starting out with this, you are going to have a lifetime of witnessing miracles of recovery right in front of you. And many of these will be people you work with. And you're going to see the light come back into their eyes. You're going to see their health improve. You're going to see everything about them change. And you're going to know that through God's grace you had a hand in that. That you were picked, you were selected to carry God's message. And you're leaving the results up to Him, but you're carrying the message. And that's the only way it's going to get carried. That's why we're here. And so when we look at fear, we have to look at something which is of enormous importance. We're going to have to look at something which is a recurring nightmare. Why should that be? Why would it not be possible for us to be free of fear once and for all? One of the interesting things about the genesis of the growth of the 12-step program is the recognition of the early members that they couldn't outrun fear. That whatever fears they brought in were going to be taken from them, but that fear was going to recur. Now then, if we recognize and understand the truth of it, that fear is the trigger, the force behind our dishonesty and selfishness and resentment, then we have to understand that because fear will recur, so will all of the other defects. What they found out was that the Oxford group were entirely short-sighted in their view of the follow-on to working the steps. Their entire program of recovery, once they had completed their what amount would be the same thing as our first 9 steps, was that from then on they would simply carry a message. Well, what our guys found was that the Oxfords were wrong, because they believed that once having worked the steps, we would have reached the stage of perfection. And they found out that that wasn't true for them. They didn't make any particular judgments about those in the Oxford groups, most of whom were not alcoholics, by the way. But they found that for themselves, as they continued to go through life, the world and all of its people would continue to threaten them. And when you take threat, you get fear. And when you get fear, you get the recurrence of the other defects. That's why the 10th step came into being. It did not exist with the Oxfordians. The 10th step is a step of inspired genius which recognizes that fear is there and it is going to recur. And that as a result of that, the other defects will recur. This is not a question of God having failed in His duty to remove our defects at the 7th step. It is a function of living life. And that because we are so sensitive to threat and to the fears which it engenders, that we are going to have a tool by which we can constantly monitor ourselves, stay constantly self-aware. They also recognize and came to the same conclusion many of you have, that fear is very contagious. That when you live in an atmosphere of fear, in your home or in your business or in your social activities, in your chosen friends, if you're living in a pool of fear, it's very contagious. It is something akin to being in a lynch mob, where with the very best intentions that you would never on your own ever do anything like that, but suddenly you find yourself overwhelmed by the power of the mob. There's something that happens with us when we are exposed constantly to the fear of others. And in some cases, it's not possible to do anything to avoid that except to radically alter our lives. Sometimes, as a sponsor, you may have to finally come to the conclusion that pool of fear is so overwhelming that your sponsee's life is in danger, you may have to suggest to them that they want to find a different way to conduct their lives, and with whom. That's a pretty drastic step, and we try to do everything we can to avoid doing anything like that. And the most important thing we can do is to teach our people how to deal with fear by using a spiritual solution to fear, to stay constantly aware of the fears as they come up. For example, teach your people this, that every time they feel bad, without any exception, there will be a fear involved. You can count on it. It may be pretty obscure, but when you look for it, you're going to find it. You tell them, when you're feeling bad, ask yourself, okay, what are you afraid of now, dummy? There's something out there. What's the threat? Threat to pride, a threat to security, perhaps a threat to my sex relations or my personal relations, a threat to my sense of and need for comfort within my group, my need for society. Something is threatened. We need to be able to identify that. And we start, yes, Leslie.
This is a simple question, probably. It's recommended here that you do the resentment list and then go over it, do your fears list and then go over it with your advisor.
Yeah.
Is that doing the fifth step in steps, or is it just going over each list before you move on?
Well, let's put it this way. There isn't anything in the Big Book that tells us to do that, because remember that when the Big Book was written, it was written to go out into the hinterlands where there were no groups. There were no acknowledged members of Alcoholics Anonymous. There were only 3 groups when this book was written. The idea that the spiritual advisor would be available to aid in the writing of the 4-step wasn't really a consideration at that time. Today we know that the most effective way to help your sponsee do their 4-step is to review each of the parts as they do it. And there seems to be no legitimate reason to delay the spiritual solution to fears, because we know that there are 3 parts to the solution. Find the fear and write it down. Talk to somebody about it and ask God to remove it. So if that can be accomplished in the 4-step, I can see no harm to that at all. We know that by the time we get to the 5th step, if these fears have not been admitted to another person, that when they are admitted in the 5th step, they disappear, they go away. But it's been my practice to go through the 4-step with my sponsees in pretty thorough fashion. What happens is that you have not done a 5th step, but when you get to the 5th step, you as a sponsor know pretty well what you're doing. You know what's coming, and you can pretty well organize it. It probably will save some time in the 5th step to get down to the meat of the problem. There is also this, that in the discussion and the review of the written material as a person goes through the 4-step, the articulation of many of these things is going to be of enormous value to them, because their 4th step will commence to take on the dimensions of great big relief. A lot of spiritual contact will begin to appear. So, your question is that isn't this doing the 5th step in bits and pieces? My answer is, in one sense, it is, but when we talk about the 5th step starting in a couple of weeks, we're going to see how this all has to be pulled together, because remember that we're going to have to go from the 5th step to the 6th step and the 7th step and the 8th and the 9th step. And in the 5th step, we get to pull all that together and make sense out of it. Okay? So let's take a look now at page 67, please. Bottom of the page, the last partial paragraph. Notice that the word fear is bracketed alongside the difficulties with Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, the employer, and the wife. This is, of course, a reference to the resentment list, And it reminds us that we determined as we did our resentment list that each and all of the resentments were triggered by and initiated as a result of a sense of threat and interference with our natural instincts. In other words, that fear was behind each and every one of our resentments. By extension, of course, we also realize that since resentment is simply long-term or persistent anger, that fear is the trigger for anger as well, just as Bill said in his article. So we're being reminded to see how powerful fear has been. And remember last week when we were talking about the list of our own faults, one of the things that we had to look at was in our relationships with others, where were we afraid? What was it that engendered fear? Because again, fear permeates the entire fourth step. It is the universal defect. It is that one defect without which the other defects would not be operative. So it's the entire trigger mechanism for all of this stuff. Let's go on. This short word somehow touches about every aspect of our lives. And that's the truth. Take that as literal truth. That fear touches about every aspect of our lives. It was an evil and corroding thread. The fabric of our existence was shot through with it. It set in motion trains of circumstances which brought us misfortune we felt we didn't deserve. But did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Now this is taking us back again, isn't it, to personal responsibility. Remember what we learned back during the third step, that our problems are of our own making, that they arise out of self, and that the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot. And here again, did not we ourselves set the ball rolling? Sometimes we think fear ought to be classed with stealing. It seems to cause more trouble. All right, now that's the problem. And as always in the big book, the next thing we expect to find is the solution. Page 68. We reviewed our fears thoroughly. We put them on paper, even though we had no resentment or connection with them. Let's see how we're going to go about doing this now. We're going to review our fears thoroughly, and we're going to put them on paper. What is it, how do we go about identifying our fears in such a way that we can put names on them, that we can put labels on them, that we can delineate them in such a way that they're meaningful to us and perhaps to others? Much of what we have suffered from in the realm of fear has been undifferentiated, free-floating, a kind of anxiety. Mainly because we didn't really concentrate on anything until we got here. We felt terrible. We knew we were afraid. We weren't identifying the cause of our fear, and we weren't identifying our fears except in some really gross way, that we're afraid of going to jail or something like that. But the truth of the matter is that our fears go right to the core of our being. And they relate to everything which has happened to us up till now, till the day we walked in, and perhaps even after that, depending on how soon we get ourselves to a sponsor and start doing this work. So the first thing you want to do as a sponsor is you want to have your sponsee sit down, and you want to give them a list of those fears which are pretty much things which have attacked everybody, things which have been the root cause of almost everyone's difficulties, with the caveat, of course, that this is not intended to be all-inclusive and that they may have a whole bunch of specialized fears of their own relating to their own particular situation. But what we do by doing this is we get them started. we give them something which will kickstart their list of fears. Now, why don't we do this? Let's take our 10-minute break right now, and when we come back, we'll start out by... well then, let's get going again. If you're taking notes, you might want to mark these down. If you have the sponsorship guide, you'll find questions are listed in there. Okay, I'm going to give you a list of the most important of these spheres. You'll find some others listed in the sponsorship guide if you've got one of those. We're going to get some more of them printed up, but it'll probably be a week or so before we get that done. First of all, make a list. Just call it standard fears. This is what you give to your sponsees. Have them put at the top, I am afraid of. Number one, losing what I have. This is an all-pervasive fear. It's one which begins way back when your sponsee first started accumulating things, even as children, toys and possessions, and the security of the family, and things in school. But as they grew older and they began to follow the dictates of common societal beliefs, what they did was to attempt to accumulate the things of the world and to depend upon the things of the world and the things of the flesh for happiness and security. And what happened was that they began to build a little castle for themselves. What they didn't realize was that this castle was built on sand. And as the anxieties and fears and threats began to come from all sides, it battered down the walls of the castle. And the most apparent fear at that point was fear of loss of what they had. Number two is fear of not getting what I want or need. This is a fear that drives us to all kinds of absurd actions, extremes. It's like we have determined how our lives are to be. And a lot of that's based upon societal values, things which people have insisted are essential to a happy life. And in modern times, it's kind of interesting because a lot of your sponsees are going to come to you believing that they are entitled. We've got this entitlement stuff going on now. That these somehow or another, these things are meant to be, and if they're not getting them, that it's society's fault. Maybe it's even God's fault. It's certainly the fault of those around them. It's the fault of a dysfunctional family. It's the fault of this, fault of that. These wants and needs are being frustrated, and they're afraid that they're not going to get the things that they want. And in some instances, they've even boiled it down to the things that they need. Not too many people these days are truly afraid of starving to death, or truly afraid that that there's no way they could ever have a roof over their heads. Sometimes you'll find people who have gone so far down that that's a real fear. So a lot of this stuff really relates to wants. I'd like you to look at page 553, please. 553. The last paragraph on that page. This great experience that released me from the bondage of hatred and replaced it with love is really just an affirmation of the truth I know. I get everything I need in Alcoholics Anonymous. Everything I need, I get. And when I get what I need, I invariably find that it was just what I wanted all the time. Please remember that, because when you're working with your sponsees on this particular fear, it's important for you to point that out to them and discuss with them what that really means. Number 3 is rejection. Never underestimate the power of rejection, the fear of rejection. Because this goes to a very powerful, basic human instinct. We call it the instinct for society. To be in the society of our fellows, to be accepted, to be admired, to be approved of, to be given plenty of good dogs and attaboys, attagirls. To feel as though we are part of a group is a basic human need and drive. Very powerful one. Think about it in your own life, and you can probably recall instances where you felt that your place within a group was threatened, or might be threatened, or even there was a hint of a threat. And you began to do outlandish things in order to maintain your position within the group and to make sure that people thought kindly of you. Your sponsees will have been doing the same thing. And this fear of being rejected is something which is almost universal with all human beings. There are a lot of threats to our relationship with any group, and of course, most of those threats are threats that we engendered by our own actions. We're the authors of our own misery. God didn't do it. Number 4 is threat of failure, the fear of failure. It's pretty obvious where that comes from, isn't it? Because failure has been the lot of your sponsee in many areas of his or her life. It's just a fact. Failure of relationships has been common, failure of businesses, failure of friendships, failure of plans and great plans, schemes, and devices that they'd come up with. Simply a failure to live up to the gifts which God gave them, to use their talents. They know that they have tried to skate. They know that they have tried to do little or nothing and yet get away with it. They know that they had all kinds of opportunities, all kinds of talents, all sorts of things which they knew were there for them, but they failed to utilize them. They ignored them. They went their own way and they lived their own selfish way of life. Now they know this, and you see what's happened here. And here's the problem. In a state of denial, your sponsee is going to have come to a very hard place in the road where they have been denying their failures were caused by their own actions. They're not going to look at it that way. And they have convinced themselves that their failures are the result of other people and of their circumstances, the circumstances of their birth, their economic situation, circumstances of their early training. Perhaps they've been abused, perhaps they've been abandoned, perhaps all sorts of terrible and horrible things have happened in their lives. And they've convinced themselves that their failures were the direct result of these things over which they had no control. And because of that, you can see how the genesis of this fear is insidious, because if their failures are the result of the things over which they have no control, and now they're really recognizing their powerlessness, then the fear of failure is very real because there's nothing they can do about it. We're going to have to show them that failure by the world's standards is not what we're talking about at all. Because we're not going to try to apply the world's indicia of success to ourselves. We're on a different plane now. We're on a spiritual plane. We're going to be living in accordance with a spiritual way of life. And therefore, success or failure is going to be measured in spiritual terms, not in terms of houses, cars, money, gold jewelry, positions, acclaim, all that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, success is going to boil down to the simplest, easiest kind of bottom line. If today I do what I am supposed to do, if today I do what's in front of me to be done, if today I do the next right thing as it presents itself, if today I do not harm another human being, and if through all of this I have left the results up to God, when I retire tonight, I will know that I've had a successful day. We're going to be measuring success, not in terms of the result. Number 5, fear of being found out for who we really are. Most of your sponsees will have been living inside and outside of AA a life which they projected to all others, which was not at all truly indicative of their real self. We portray ourselves through the roles that we play. You're going to find a lot of people in this fellowship who have an AA persona. And that persona they assiduously project at every opportunity. But it hasn't a thing to do with the way they really are. It's just a role that's being played. And the problem there is that because it's a role, it's a lie, and because it's a lie, it's going to be easily found out. Sooner or later, a slip will be made. Sooner or later, somebody's going to come along who knows the truth. And there's a great fear that people are going to find out what they really are like. They don't want to be known. There's so much fear about this that it goes right to the roots of our insistence upon anonymity. And this does not mean that you are to counsel your sponsees to be open and tear down all of their defense mechanisms and all their walls and show everybody at every step of the way in every meeting exactly who and what they are. Not at all. What it does mean, what the big book says in the 5th step, that we must be entirely honest with somebody if we are to live long and happily in this world. Sooner or later, we're going to have to get down to the nitty-gritty. And the 5th step tells us that we must illuminate every dark cranny of the past and every twist of character. Somewhere along the line, this is all going to have to come out. You're going to find that your sponsees many of them will have a very strong feeling of fear that that they're going to be found out for who they really are. Number 6, fear. It's the fear of punishment. That somehow or another their past is going to inevitably lead to some very severe consequences, to being punished. And a lot of times this has been engendered by their religious education, but certainly not always. There's kind of a overwhelming sense of of guilt here, which means that we're waiting for the axe to drop. When is this going to go full circle? Remember that what goes around comes around, all those different sayings we have. When am I going to have to pay the piper for what I have done? Now, we're not going to be able to say to a sponsee, that isn't going to happen. What we're going to say to them is, you needn't live in fear of it happening, because it's all in the future and there's no way to know. But right now, the fear of this could very easily block you from God, so you're going to have to take it to Him and ask Him to remove that fear. There's another fear, which is most people have, especially after they've reached a certain age. There's a fear of getting old.
Is that 7, or is that still 6?
That'll be 7. In fact, with some, it's old, fat, and ugly. And you can get a kind of a chuckle out of them with that one. Fear of getting old, fat, and ugly. But don't minimize this. This is a very, very important fear to deal with. Along with this, you got to recognize that along with this fear comes the fear that life is passing them by, that they're never going to be able to accomplish their dreams, that life is never going to be anything more than just dull, glum, and boring, that they're going to have to be going along and going to all these meetings and doing all this boring stuff the rest of their life. All the excitement is gone. All the possibilities of growth are gone. Many of the people you sponsor will be people who have broken up or had their homes broken up from under them. Many of them have children living in other parts of the country or wherever, or they have relatives who are insanely angry with them. There's very little chance of getting their family back together, they feel. There's a sense of hopelessness about it all, and one we have to be very careful about, because we do not want to emphasize this whole idea of sobriety, that is, dryness, as being the sine qua non, the bottom line of everything, because it's not. The bottom line of everything is that we allow God to lead us, to direct our lives, and to take our lives on to better things. That's the bottom line. As a result of doing that, we are promised that the problem of alcohol will be solved. And so long as we continue to grow spiritually, it will remain solved. It will not be a problem for us. It is not even anything we have to think about anymore. We're going to get rid of all of this stuff about keeping it green and remembering your last drunk and all that stuff, because that's a total irrelevancy if we are spiritually fit. And the problem we have as sponsors is we've got to see to it, to the best of our ability, that we give our sponsees the opportunity to invoke God's power in their lives so that they do become spiritually fit, so that all these promises do come true, so that they are relieved of the obsession to drink. Remember, every meeting we hear it read that God can and will, if we seek Him, can and will what? Remove from us the obsession to drink. What the hell more do we need? If we're seeking God, the promise is that the obsession will be gone. And that's the truth. But this means seeking God with a good heart, and it means seeking God through the practice of the 12 steps. When we work the steps, the most important thing we're doing is seeking God. We're seeking to come to know Him. We're seeking to get an understanding of God as He relates to us. We're seeking to surrender. And we're seeking to know and to do His will. And when we have reached that point, then we enter the world of the Spirit. Then we become God conscious. Then we're restored to sanity. And from there on, our sole and single job is to continue to grow spiritually. Because under those circumstances, we will never slip back. But that means doing all the things that are necessary each day for continued spiritual growth. And that, of course, includes carrying the message to others. Very big time includes that. So you can see here that your sponsee is dealing with a very deep-seated fear, which the further they've come along in the way of destroying their lives and age can have a lot to do with it. A lot of people reach 35 and 40, 45, and they've gotten into the mindset that their life is over, for God's sakes, which always gives me a big chuckle. Somebody was sitting, I forget the guy's name, is sitting over here. He ain't got any gray in his hair. His face is unlined. He was talking about he's getting old, and I was finding it very difficult to feel sorry for him, you know. But this is a feeling which you're going to run into this with many of your sponsees, that life has passed them by, that from now on it's just going to be a struggle to stay sober and to get the bills paid, and life's a bitch, and so what? But you can look them right in the eye and you can promise them this is not so. This is not the truth. That if you do these things, which the steps lay out for you, if you follow directions, you are bound to have a life beyond anything you could imagine. You have no idea what it may be, and if you're doing God's will, it won't even matter where you are. You could be running a cattle station in the outback of Australia, and you only have Aborigines for neighbors, and if it's God's will for you to be there, you're going to be happy as a clam at high tide. That's what you tell them. And you'll be just doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing. And who knows, there might be a drunk or two among those Aborigines who would love to see the big book translated into Aborigine talk. You can go about doing that too. They're all, here's the thing, once we get sober and get on a spiritual path, the sky is the limit. Why would anybody think about placing limitations on God's power to move our lives into positive directions when we say that we're trusting Him to get us sober? Does that make sense? If we say that God has all power and all knowledge, do we mean it? Or are we going to sit here in our pity pot and say, oh, my life is over? Do you need to work with your folks on this? Because it's just not so. Number 8. The program won't work for me. Especially you're going to find this with people who have been in and out, in and out, in and out. They're the ones that on their last slip were down at the local bar saying, well, I tried that A of A stuff, but it don't work. I'm an alcoholic. That means I'm supposed to drink. Give me another double. And it's awfully easy to fall into that trap. It'll work for everybody else, but it won't work for me. And a lot of times, guys, that feeling that it won't work for them is going to be a direct result of the guilt that they're carrying around. And many people feel so guilty when they come in here that they really don't think that they deserve any of God's grace. And they're really doubtful about whether anything can be done, that even whether God's going to want to help them. One of the things we need to assure them of is that they're only here through God's grace. For every one of us here, there are 10 out there who have never made it and never will. They were chosen. This isn't a bingo game that they were directed into by mistake. They're here because God wills it. And you know, when you're sponsoring people, when you're carrying the message, never, never, never make the mistake of trying to outguess God on this. Why? Well, he came in from a nudge from the judge. Obviously, he hasn't hit his bottom yet. We take every single person who seeks help from us and we say, yes. And we start right in to help them as best we know how. We use the program and the steps and our best experience, and we throw ourselves into the task, and we don't doubt God and we don't doubt His power, and we leave the results up to Him. And when we do that, we grow spiritually. When we do that, we take the grace we've been given and we solidify it as being ours. Because when we try to sit on that grace, it sours and rots within us. And pretty soon we lose it. We cannot keep what we've been given until and unless we're willing to do whatever it takes to give it away to whomever asks for it. We do not put ourselves in a position of judging whether another person is going to make it or not. There may come a time when you're working with them when you recognize that that they are not willing to do the work. It's at that point that you have to go on to somebody else. Remember, we talked about this before. You want to find out if a newcomer is somebody who's got some willingness. You give them the big book, just as it tells us in chapter 7, and you say to them, read the book. Now, if that newcomer will read the book, then you can be pretty sure that they want what you've got. And then you can go pedal to the metal. The book, we're told to have them do that anyway, but what I'm suggesting to you is save your determination of whether this is someone that you should be working with or not until after you've given them the opportunity to read the book. I can tell you this, that the one who was reticent, who was unsure, who may have been forced in here by circumstances or a wife or a judge or an employer, who actually reads the book. If they're an alcoholic, when they read that book, they're going to see themselves in those pages. And they're going to not only see themselves, but they're going to see that there is a solution. And they're going to have hope of recovery. And then when you talk to them after they read the book, you can ask them, do you want what we have, and are you willing to go to any lengths to get it? And you can be pretty sure that when they say, yes, I'm willing to go to any lengths, that they actually mean it. Okay, so those are some of the standard fears. You tell your sponsee to put down any fears that they have which are unique to them. But remember that part of this fears list will be a written exposition of the cause of the fear. What is the threat? What is the threat? As best they can determine it. Now, once that has been done, yes.
That's where I see people struggle a lot with the causes of the fear, and it looks like, at least for me, a lot of the cause, regardless of the ones we've talked about, is lack of faith.
Well,
But that's where
there's no question that that's right, because lack of faith is faith is the antithesis of fear, obviously. If I have faith, that means that I trust God. If I trust God in all circumstances, of what do I have to be afraid? If I claim a lot of faith and yet I'm running around scared, I'm insulting the heck out of God. I'm really saying to him, I don't trust you. And so the growth of faith is the ultimate spiritual solution to fear, no doubt about it. At first, faith may be a bit scanty when we're only here at the fourth step. Why don't we read about it here and see, because you're dead right about it. Faith and fear can't live in the same house. The ultimate solution to fear is the growth of faith. However, at this point, remember, we've got people new coming in who are loaded with fear, and we need to help them get rid of those fears that they carried in with them. We're not going to be able to wait for their faith to grow for those fears to go away.
you have to see some suggestions to help them get to the causes.
Well, yes. The common cause will be a threat or an interference with their pride. Remember that pride is the godfather of all of our defects. Fear is the hitman it sends out to destroy us. So many, many times those fears are the result of a direct threat to their pride. Most of the time a fear also relates to something which has happened in the past, where there was a bad result. And the idea being that the past will always repeat itself. Sometimes a fear is the result of a direct threat, for example, to a sex relationship, or a direct threat to a person's security, or a direct threat to their acceptance within their group, which is their sense of their instinct for society. But usually these threats are more amorphous. They arise out of the past, and although ego and pride are something that we don't like to admit to, some people do out of an excess of humility, but basically, in our innermost selves, we're not real happy to admit to pride and ego. But you got to get your sponsee to look at that these threats are directly at their pride. Okay, now let's get to the solution. We know that we're going to write down these fears. We're going to write down what caused them. Let's go to the second paragraph on page 68, please. These two paragraphs that are coming up here are two of the most important paragraphs in the big book. They contain a whole lot more than simply the solution to fear. Perhaps there's a better way. We think so. For we're now on a different basis, the basis of trusting and relying upon God. We trust infinite God rather than our finite selves. We are in the world to play the role He assigns. Now then, this next sentence is very important because it answers your sponsee's question. How do I know what God's will is for me? And here is the answer. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. In other words, we are to do what we believe God would have us do. But in doing that, we must rely upon God for the solution, or for the result. We leave the results up to Him. Let's turn to page 452, please. The next to the last paragraph, 452. Acceptance is the key to my relationship with God today. I never just sit and do nothing while waiting for Him to tell me what to do. Rather, I do whatever is in front of me to be done, and I leave the results up to Him. However it turns out, that's God's will for me. So we're not going to let our sponsees hide out in this business. I don't know what His will is for me. So what are you doing? Well, I'm surfing right now through my 200 channels. Just to the extent that we do as we think He would have us and humbly rely on Him, does He enable us to match calamity with serenity. That's our out clause. No longer can we duck out of life by saying we don't know what God's will is for us. Next paragraph, we never apologize to anyone for depending upon our Creator. Well, that's a laugh. We hear that around the rooms all the time. Oh, well, we don't want to talk about God. Somebody might get put off by it. We can laugh at those who think spirituality the way of weakness. Paradoxically, it is the way of strength. The verdict of the ages is that faith means courage. All men of faith have courage. And I have to tell you this, one of the things which will keep your sponsees from making it is that they're too chicken-hearted. This program requires that we have a certain amount of intestinal fortitude, because we have to face ourselves fearlessly. Remember the 4-step, fearlessly. Thorough and fearless. And so, sissies don't make it in here. I'm sorry to say that. Because somewhere along the line, they're not going to be willing to do what it takes to face themselves. Remember what you hear every time you hear chapter 5 being read. Those who cannot or will not be honest with themselves are the ones who don't make it. And that's precisely because they lack even that much courage to face themselves. They trust their God. We never apologize for God. Oh, Bill, don't turn over in your grave when you say that. Instead, now listen to this, because here we're going right back to the third step. Instead, we let Him demonstrate through us what He can do. Everybody remember that now. Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of Thy power, Thy love, and Thy way of life. Let me be an example to others that I want to help of your power, your love, and your way of life working in and through me. And here we say it again. Instead, we let him demonstrate, God demonstrate through us what he can do. What he has done for us, he can do for you. Now here's the solution. We ask him to remove our fear and direct our attention to what he would have us be. At once, we commence to outgrow fear. We have written down our fears. We have written down what caused our fears. And now we take them to God and ask him to remove them. And we ask him to direct our attention to what he would have us be. The fear's prayer goes like this. God, these are my fears. And then we tell God our fears. I'm powerless over these fears. I cannot get rid of them myself. And I need your help. God, please, please remove these fears from me and show me what you would have me be. Now when we do that, at once we commence to outgrow fear. And there are a whole bunch of people in this room right now who have experienced that and know that that's the truth. That's exactly what happens. Now I want to refer you to the final solution to fears. We'll go to page 75 right quick, please. The middle paragraph. This is the fifth step. Remember, in our fifth step, we are articulating our defects to another person. We pocket our pride and go to it, illuminating every twist of character, every dark cranny of the past. Notice there isn't anything there about talking about all our good stuff. The reason for that's simple. The good stuff isn't killing us. It's the bad stuff that's killing us. Once we have taken this step, withholding nothing, we are delighted. We can look the world in the eye. We can be alone at perfect peace and ease. 5 words. Our fears fall from us. Ergo. What's the solution for fear? Fear, recognized and written down, admitted to another person, and turned over to God, equals no fear. And that works every time. That's the spiritual solution to fear. Therefore, nobody ever has to stay buried in fear as long as they know what to do about it, and as long as they are willing to use these spiritual tools. This does not mean that the fears won't come back, because obviously that's why we have a 10th step and we have 11-step inventory, because we know that fear will come back when we are again threatened or when we are living bathed in the fear of others. But nevertheless, whenever it recurs, we have the spiritual tools to deal with it. We recognize it and write it down. Write it down. Got to get it out of our heads and down on paper. We discuss it with another person and we ask God to take it. And when we do that, the fear is removed. Pretty simple, isn't it? We no longer have to go along with some of the human solution stuff which would have us literally living in fear and trying in some way to accept that that's a natural human condition. It isn't what God wishes for us. God wishes for us to eventually have so much faith in him that our fears will recede and recede and recede. We need to finally become serene enough that people have to hold a mirror up to our mouths to make sure we're still breathing. We need to be as fearless as our faith will take us. We need to have more guts than a slaughterhouse. And sooner or later that comes. Absolutely comes. You will reach a point where you will not be afraid to do anything because you will trust God that much. As the big book says, that we can go to the most sordid spot on earth if we are there on God's business, and he will protect us. It's true. All right, next week then, we're going to be looking at our sex inventory and how we go about helping our sponsee with that. And I plan to be here, God willing the creek don't rise. I hope you will be too. I want to thank you for all of your kind attention today. And does anybody need to pick up a chip today for any?